Welcome to the Consulting Growth Podcast. I have the pleasure today of being joined by Denzil Rankine, who, as well as many other things in his life, has founded, grew, and sold, and is now in fact, you were the chairman of AMR, but now you're a managing director at Stax. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. And it's very happy to join you for this discussion today.
Thank you, and thanks so much for your time. I realise this is your first day back at work, and I'm privileged to be given some of your time because in fact, we'll get on to later to how you achieve all that you've managed to achieve, just in terms of time management, because you've published more than me, but also at the same time managed to grow a successful company and do various other things, which are fascinating. But I thought it would be useful to start off if you could give the audience an idea of how you got to where you are now, sort of a potted history of how you went from, I believe it was a degree in law at Kent, all the way through to where you are now, please.
Yes, very, very happy to do that. And I'll do it at a high level. But you're absolutely right. I went to the University of Kent at Canterbury, and I got a 2-2 in law. I didn't enjoy academia at all. So I did the minimum, and I thought if I got that kind of level, I'd be okay. I failed to get into Oxford, and that really annoyed me. But in fact, it perhaps was one of the best things that ever happened to me. So after the University of Kent, I decided that I wouldn't like to be a lawyer, partly because I hadn't studied much, and secondly, because I met a lot of barristers, because you have to eat dinners if you're going to become a barrister. And I thought, this is not for me. So I just simply got a job. That was in the city in reinsurance broking, which apparently is a very sexy part of insurance. And again, that wasn't quite right for me. But I did meet two people who were management consultants. And if we go back then, we're looking at a long time ago, well over 30 years, management consulting was a much smaller profession then and very different to today. I then looked into this further because I discovered, I really thought, this is what I want to do. I want to help companies understand how they can do things differently. And I was absolutely fascinated by that. And I remember meeting a management consultant who said to me, well, did you go to Oxford or Cambridge? And I said, no. Do you have a first-class degree? I said, no. He said, do you have a 2-1? I said, no. And he said, you will never be a management consultant.
Oh, wow. An optimist then.
Yeah, well, that really annoyed me. So I then answered an ad in The Guardian in the days when you had ads.
Wow.
And it was management consulting, but they were fibbing. It was actually industrial market research. And I got that job. And it was just exactly what I wanted to do. So it's a 4-person company in London, 4 people in New York, industrial market research that's running around asking people questions about conveyor belts and valves and so on, because there simply was no information. And those were the days when information was power. So I was with that firm for 4 years and I outgrew it. And I then joined a firm which had actually been created by some of the people who'd been in reinsurance. And they'd come out of more grown-up firms like Deloitte and Coopers and so on. And I joined them at the age of 27 to create a division within their consulting firm, which was called SEER, spelled S-E-E-R. They had a view that you could support private equity with consulting services. So you could say they were 10, 15 years ahead of their time. And they struggled really to make that work. They were overextended, and it was really founded on gold credit cards. And so when the recession came in 1991, they went bust. During the time at SEER, I went through a massive amount of pain because as a 27-year-old going around trying to offer consulting services, a lot of grey-haired people said, well, you're too young, you don't know what you're doing. And they were probably right. But I was very fortunate to come across some people who believed in what I was offering in this small part of this firm that was a bit flaky. And I remember there was one guy who was called Paul Lester, who was working at Doughty. And he said, yes, we'll give you this project. And it was really industrial market research around bits of aeroplanes. He said, but I'm just going to wait a couple of weeks because then it will be classed as an acquisition. And that money comes from a different pot. And that was an absolute light bulb. I had no clue that he would be allocating projects from different, either from his P&L or from a corporate pot. But I just love this idea of there being a different and bigger pot. And I also really believed in industrial market research, going and asking questions to find out where markets were going. And I put two and two together and said, well, when you buy a company, you should really ask the customers if they're, what they think of that company and if it's any good.
Yep.
And at the time, it was really not done. And people would say, well, our sales force and our management, we know the business and we've got the accountants and lawyers and so on. And so it wasn't really happening. So when SEER went bust, I was not quite 30. And I thought, well, what am I going to do? Do my CV or keep going? And so I decided to keep going and very much position the business on commercial due diligence, which I had to explain to everyone because the term was really not well known. But the great thing is that I had a small number of clients who I could take over because SEER had gone bust. So I set up on the lowest cost base possible, thinking that the business would fail. On the first day of the first Gulf War, so that was the 17th of January 1991, turned on the radio and there was the news about the tanks going across the desert. And obviously that leads to a recession. And I went to the office and started the business. And it went incredibly well because I was so fortunate from the point of view where I could start low cost base, some relationships with clients who liked what was being on offer, and then also slowly building commercial due diligence, which was really a fledgling industry at the time. I also set up sharing offices with another guy I got on very well with, who had been left high and dry by the bankruptcy of SEER, and he was in really what you'd call corporate finance, so helping companies find new owners or new shareholding and so on. So we would go in parallel to go and call on clients. I would be offering the research, the strategy research and commercial due diligence, and he'd be offering the work around corporate broking and so on. So we could actually piggyback off each other with complementary services, and we shared some costs and offices and so on. So that was a really great relationship and a great way to start in a very uncertain circumstance. So that was the beginning. And then the business did well to begin with because we had really a low cost base. And it wasn't really until 1995, so that's 4 years later, that we got our first private equity client in commercial due diligence because the market was really nascent. So it had all been corporate, or in American, you call them strategic clients. And we just grew slowly and cautiously. And I thought it would never be anything more than a cottage industry. Now, actually, the commercial due diligence market is, whether it's worth $500 million or $1 billion, it's a massive market. But I grew the business on that basis of just thinking it would always be small, and managed to maintain a profitable business from that point.
Brilliant.
We then go through various growth phases. So private equity started getting involved in commercial due diligence. Other people had seen this in parallel. So there were a couple of other firms who were offering this service, and we sort of ended up bumping into each other a little bit. And the market grew. And you then get to the stage where the accounting firms saw it. And I remember KPMG came along and said, oh, we want to collaborate with you. But they just basically took the phone list and then phoned everyone up.
Yes, of course, yes.
EY came along and said, we will buy you, money is no object, but they didn't mean that at all. Yeah. There was interest, and then the market grew with the accountants getting into it. And then the strategy houses discovered they'd been doing a bit of it, and they would get into it. And it really wasn't rocket science. So I industrialized our process, really still insecure because I had this 2-2 and I was industrial market. But I got people from Boston Consulting Group and ex-McKinsey to come and run some of our training programs. And you also mentioned that I'm an author, and that's true. I did write a book. It started as a pamphlet with a former colleague from SEER, And someone said, well, you should turn this into a book. So it was about how to buy a company. And believe it or not, a publisher, Wiley, came along and they were interested in it because there weren't many books. So it was a big struggle, but I got there and actually wrote this book about acquisition. And I did that because I thought, well, I need a bit of credibility in this world where everyone comes from this sort of big-brained background. And it got published. And after being published, it's staggering. Publishers then thought I was an author. And so the Financial Times came along. And the big achievement was to actually get a book with just 3 things written on the front: Financial Times, commercial due diligence, Denzil. So that was a way of creating some publicity. And I then went on to write other books. So Why Acquisitions Fail was really my favorite. Very difficult to get the publisher to agree to that because it's got a negative in it.
Sure.
But I believe that if you get something wrong, you can learn from it. And then the lessons from failure were good. So I use those books as also a way of promotion and dealing with the insecurity that I had. And I wrote far too many. There were 5 books on acquisition in the end. And it was only after really too long that I realized that what I needed to do in front of clients was give them a completely different answer to the question. Because they would say, how did you found this firm? Did you come out of McKinsey? Did you come out of BCG? Have you been to Harvard? And all this kind of stuff. And the answer is really simple. You look at them in the eyes, and I said, I've done none of that whatsoever. I have founded this business as an entrepreneur, and I now hire people from Harvard, McKinsey, and those firms. Sure. And they looked at me then and said, wow. And it took me far too long to realize that I actually had the winning formula without all of that so-called academic stuff. So the business grew, and we got to a stage where we realized that the UK market was only so big. So we thought, what else can we do? So we saw that Germany, there was nothing. So we opened up in Germany way ahead of anyone else. And I remember there was one time when we'd actually worked on 1/3 of all deals in Germany. I mean,
wow.
Yeah, it was tiny. That's the correct statistic. And then we opened in the United States because a client wanted us to open there. But then we found that the German market, there was suddenly lots of people got into it and jumped into it, and we weren't really very strong there. So eventually we pulled out of that. The US was a great place. I mean, it took me a long time to agree to open in the US because I know that it's a graveyard for the well-intentioned Brits.
Sure. Yep.
But I have done a lot of work in the United States. And the simple point is that if you're a Brit, you can really make the US a success because somehow Brits are welcomed there. It's a brutal market. It's very different. But I put time into it and was commuting to the US, I guess, at least once a month for a long time, and built up a really good client base there. And commercial due diligence was just so far behind. The US was way, way behind. And so we're pioneering, developing the market there. And what's called sell side, which means that the work to investigate the company is commissioned by the seller. That was considered to be something which would never happen in the United States, and now that's a massive industry. So again, opened up with the support of a client who just begged us to open in the US because they couldn't find the right service. So we did a deal with them. They guaranteed us a small number of projects. So opened up in New York, and that was really, really great. And developed that. So I spent a lot of time in the United States. So the business really came about because I saw an opportunity for something which was new. I went in low cost base, and I found the way to create the relationships and the credibility. And since then, the market has grown, and we've gone through various phases. I can come to talk later about the exit, but let me draw breath. That's given you.
Oh, well, thank you. Fascinating. I've got so many questions. So, okay. So, I think you're being somewhat disingenuous with your. Your first mover advantage will get you there, but you know as well as I do that where these decisions are typically, at board level when it comes to merger and acquisition, and certainly push down perhaps a rung or two when it comes to due diligence. But once the other big players got involved, it couldn't have just been first mover advantage that allowed you to continue growing, because, as you know, these firms have these relationships tied up. So if McKinsey or Bain or KPMG want to elbow in on an M&A deal, they typically call on someone they went to school with, as you said, Oxbridge, or someone that used to work at the firm. So once the competition started to get interested, I'd be interested in how you survived, let alone continue to grow.
Yeah, it was very worrying when, as I said, KPMG took the phone list and others attacked. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is going to be really tough. And it turned out that it was less frightening than I thought, but I certainly lost some sleep at the time. So we went from a cottage industry, and no one really knew what this was, to industrializing commercial due diligence in the early days. So I created a system whereby we could industrialize it, have a process that is really templated in a mechanism. And that worked well. And the business really grew very well based on that. And then, as you say, the competition came in. So having had an established position, it did help. But then we found that there was increased competition. So the trick became, I thought, to specialize. So we ended up then specializing in a set of sectors, and they were related to some of the core clients that we had. And over time, we then narrowed down and down and down. And you could argue we narrowed too far. So the clients which I had a very strong relationship with on day one was Reed International, now known as Relex. And so it's really in the sectors they were involved in was a big part of our focus, as well as some others such as industrial products. We then focused down and down and ended up in the end focusing a lot on the events industry, trade shows, which is a relatively small industry, but one which I really felt connected to and really enjoyed. And so we really, you could say, became world leader in that small industry. So we went from, I guess, pioneering commercial due diligence for anyone to industrializing it through a set of focusing and then looking at the events industry at the same time as globalizing. And the events industry is global. So we really focused on that. So there was a lot of changes. And I think you're right. As the industry became more competitive, we decided to change focus on a number of occasions.
And I'd be interested. I've done a bit of research on elitism in strategy consulting specifically, and I'd be interested in your take on this. But it strikes me that, especially over the last 10 years, many clients, even in strategy consulting, have got a bit tired of the sort of Oxbridge, Harvard-educated MBAs coming in the traditional route and then giving advice to the board at the age of 28. And I think it's not necessarily a dominant buyer's market, but it strikes me that there are opportunities for people that don't come from that traditional background, perhaps more so than there were 30, 40 years ago, when many people would have been locked out by not going to Oxbridge or Harvard. I don't know if you experienced clients who actually saw your non-traditional background as a benefit rather than a hindrance.
Yes, obviously you need to segment the market. So you're right. When you talk about 30 years ago, that was when I was beginning. Consulting was very small, and in strategy consulting, you're expected to have come from that elite background. I came in through the angle of industrial market research and commercial due diligence, and then really turning an industrial market research firm into a strategy firm. A really great voyage. On your point about elitism, you need to segment the market. I can think specifically of clients where we have lost simply because they wanted to use a big brand and a big name and would not have had confidence in us. I can think of other clients, and maybe I can think of specifically half a dozen individuals over the years we've worked with who just have the confidence to say, no, we actually really like AMR, Denzil, and the team, and we like them, and we know its value, and we're going to work with them a lot. So you need to pick your clients and realize those clients are going to pick you, and some of them are very astute. There are also others. I mean, some people will go and use the accounting firm and use them for everything, and that you might get okay results, not fantastic results across the board. But again, you can't be fired for buying from IBM.
Sure.
Comes into that, and they're not very sophisticated buyers. So the short answer is you will find a wide range of clients, and you will definitely find some who want to go with a smaller house, and sometimes they will like that because it's going to be partner-led. You mentioned the 28-year-old, it's the big house, the partner sells it and disappears off. And sometimes they're looking for value, but there's definitely a segmentation in the consulting market and an opportunity for the smaller folks.
Yep. But
if you look at the growth, I don't know if you've studied that, just the growth rates of different consulting firms, I think you'll find that the higher growth is coming from some of those larger firms as well.
Yeah.
So there's always going to be the opportunity for entrepreneurs and startups, but I think you've got to make sure that you know what your offering is, who your clients are, and accept you're not going to work with everyone. You need to find those who are going to want your specific offering, not the big brand.
Thank you. Another question I had is in terms of your growth pains. It seems that you've done a lot of best practice in terms of industrializing or productizing some of your innate knowledge into formal products or services. And certainly having the low cost base isn't going to do you any harm at all. Were there any other than various people trying to steal or actually stealing your client list? Were there any growth challenges that you had that were unexpected or that you struggled with?
Well, I mean, growth is just always a challenge. I think there was a period when the phone rang off the hook and we didn't really have to do any selling. But out of the 30 years, that really was a short period. And I remember way back when a colleague said, we've got to a stage where we no longer have to hire someone with a broken wing. A small business, yes, low cost base, but to go out and find the talent that you can afford is really tough. And then once you've found the talent you can afford, you then have to make sure they actually have the ability to operate in this environment. Just do not underestimate how naive people are when they come out of a brand. So the best example I can give you is the people who created SEER that I mentioned, out of which AMR came. They came mostly out of Deloitte and Coopers. They set up an office. They got some people, they connected the telephone, because telephones were what we used in those days, and they went to the office and sat looking at the phone and expected it to ring. And they were really, really surprised that it didn't ring automatically, completely naive. And I turned up as a salesman, and they thought that was a breath of fresh air. So it's really extraordinary how people do not understand when they come out of a brand, how difficult it is to make the phone ring.
And how did you deal with? I mean, this is a challenge that a lot of boutiques have, is that they don't have the brand recognition either on the sales side, but also on the other important side, which is the talent side. So they very often, and obviously their pipeline is sometimes lumpy, so they end up recruiting a load of people all of a sudden, and perhaps some of them aren't necessarily the people that McKinsey might have picked up. So what did you also systematize or industrialize your talent side of things, or was it much more around one-to-one mentoring?
Well, I think when you look at talent, if you're looking at lower down the ranks, you want to obviously have a process whereby you're going to figure out how to get the best people, evaluate them, bring them on board. And in consulting at the lower end of new grads or whatever, you're going to have a 50% fallout pretty fast, however clever you are with your system. And then mentoring, yes. I think when I talk about the challenge of people, I think I start at the top, and hiring partners is very difficult because they want to work in a small firm. A lot of people will be risk averse, and then you need to be able to afford the right people, and then those people need to be able, in a growing firm, to understand how to get business developments and not just serve clients that are given. So it's a very specific type of person you're looking for, and it's challenging to find them and afford them, and then maintain them. As you say, the business can be lumpy. So the first person I took on as a partner, I had a stream of work, which was actually, believe it or not, helping Indian businesses come into the UK that needed managing. And so I took this person on half time, and then he grew to full time, and that was a way to bridge some of that gap. But I think the people side is always going to be challenging, and it's wonderful when you can find people with whom you can have a really excellent working relationship founded on trust and mutual a mutual view of where to go. And we've had our fair share of difficulties with either people we've brought on as partners who have in the end got a bit exhausted or underperformed, or who actually then ended up having a different ambition. And we suffered a breakaway, as so often can happen. Then we had a apparent superstar, and I decided to step aside to a certain extent to let that person grow the business, and in the end, essentially stole quite a substantial.
Okay.
But those were decisions that I took, and with hindsight, I could have said, okay, I should have realised that this individual had my own agenda written all over him. And I didn't. I ended up wanting to collaborate and trust someone who in the end didn't want to collaborate with me. So that's a challenge you have. So you go through that, and then you have to rebuild and deal with the fallout. So I can tell you a story of how everything was an absolutely perfectly planned path over 30 years, but that's not the case at all. Recessions come,
Sure.
and they hit the business. And then you can have challenges with people, however well you try to manage them and give equity. Those can come along. So it is an obstacle course, I would say. But and you just have to find your way to manage through it.
I'm presuming, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you might have been in a better position than some founders, given that you had some expertise in mergers and acquisitions and sell side and buy side. That when at least you had a clear idea or some idea what potential buyers would be looking for.
Oh, you're talking about on exit the business?
Yeah.
Yes, it was. Yeah. I remember we approached one or two, I guess you call them brokers, to say, no, would you like to help us this? And I remember one pitch turned up, and these guys, I said to them, do you know that I've written some books about positions? And I think they were a bit surprised, and they just hadn't thought. And there they were, just producing stuff that was just so naive.
How interesting. Okay.
Why have you called us up? You know everything. And the answer is, well, actually, doctors shouldn't treat their own children. No. So maybe it would make sense to have someone help. So yes, understanding the process is helpful. It's interesting. I obviously know other people with businesses of a similar size. There are a couple of cases where I've specifically helped them find the right corporate finance or broker partner to help them, because I really believe if you have the right house helping you on your exit process, you will get a better result, because if you're not familiar with it, it is bamboozling, and you're much better off having someone help you. And yes, you'll pay them fees, but the way you look at it is the more you pay them, the better in some ways. It means they've got you a better deal, and whatever you pay them is part of the extra which they have got that you would never have got on your own.
Yes. And also getting the right, I mean, certainly from my own clients' perspective, very often, one of the founders or the CEO or send me a message saying, "Oh, we've just been approached by, advisor X. Shall we meet up with them?" And you look at advisors X books and you think there's nothing in there that matches this type of client. And it does seem that it's gone from an industry which virtually didn't exist 30 years ago to almost a very sales-driven industry, or sales at any cost in some cases.
Yeah, you need to, yes, when you're selecting which advisor to use, you simply run a process, and it's very usual to have three, and you get the three to pitch, and you figure it out. So I've just helped a friend in this, not a consulting business, but a small business. And it was an incredibly interesting process. This guy, first and foremost, when I started talking about how he was exiting, he said, "Oh, I've got these people. They're wonderful. I trust them. They're brilliant," and all the rest of it. And he did then very politely say to me a year and a half later or something, "They were completely wrong. I was misled. Thank you for challenging."
Oh, yeah, okay.
So then another one came up through a personal relationship, who I knew as well, and so on. "Oh, this is great," and we all had a breakfast together, and that was all going to happen. And then they were just not quite right. They were not sufficiently grown up. And so I said to my friend,
"These are the advisors. Right. These are the advisors, not the buyers." Yeah.
The advisors, yeah.
Yep.
So I said, this advisor's not right either, so we're going to have to do it. So I then went and found some for him, and found two, and he decided kind of on paper which one he wanted to work with. And he said, "Well, we'll just have a call with them." I said, "No, what about the other one?" So I convinced him to have the second one and know where the story's going to go. The first one he thought would be right when he met them was just wrong, and the second one blew him away.
Isn't that interesting? Gosh.
It was just great. And so they've just come to an agreement. So that's a classic story of how you go about selecting your advisor when you're selling the business. It's not easy. And you say there are a lot out there, but I don't think there are many out there who have the right fit for each particular business. Yep. So you should you just make sure you go through a careful process.
Could just on that point, because I know some of the listeners would find this quite interesting. There's obviously things that you can see in terms of, what deals have they done in the past, what people do they have, what deal are they offering you. But I'm especially interested in, that breakfast story. What type of, when you say not grown up, or what types of interpersonal things might you pick up on that you wouldn't necessarily see looking at their website?
When you sell your business, you very often as an entrepreneur, it may be the only time you sell your business, and it may be, for maybe people listening, it'll be the first time they sell the business. So you're in a whole new world. Selling the business is it could take 6 months, but it could also take 12, 18. It's a long journey, and there will be crises on the way, on that journey. It's never going to be straightforward. Everyone will tell you how perfectly everything goes. Not true. So you have to know that you will be in the trenches with that person. And if it's the smooth partner who passes you to the 28-year-old, you need to know about it. That's the real point, is it has to be someone you can go through those difficult times and bumps with, and who will play bad cop when necessary with the potential future buyer and so on. But you need to look at it through that lens. You might also phone up some people who they've represented in the past, and see how they look, how it went for them, including the problems. So it's not easy, but I just think you need to look at it through that lens.
Brilliant, thank you. And now you're on the other side. You're I'm guessing you're in an earn-out period or something along those lines. But how have you coped with going from a smaller, more boutique company to the culture of a larger company, where perhaps the reins that you can pull are different?
Yeah, it's a different environment, and I'm very happy with this new environment. So, I mean, we're now part of a firm with sort of many hundreds of people, and I'm getting used to it. So there seem to be quite a lot of meetings, but it's actually it's really good. And I think I should explain a little bit that the due diligence that was conducted on both sides was around culture.
Mm-hmm.
So we've been acquired by a firm called Stax. Stax is owned by private equity, and that private equity is called Blue Point. And so Blue Point are quite influential in the decision. And they make very few acquisitions in their holds compared to others who do a lot. So we are a very close fit with Stax, and they may make another acquisition, but not a large number. But the due diligence was based on culture, less on finance or anything else like that. And it was an extraordinary process when we discovered that we really have a genuine close cultural fit. And the way that we looked at that was just talking about how we do things. So we would say, well, look, every second Thursday we have a town hall and we tell everyone in the company what's going on, projects coming up, bits and pieces, and so on. And the guys at Stax said, well, that's extraordinary. We do exactly the same every second Thursday as well.
Right.
And then said, okay, well, when we do our staffing meetings, we look at the team, what they've been doing. We look at timesheets, and anyone whose timesheet has gone over 55 hours is in the red. And so therefore we think about, is that going to stay that way? Can we reduce it? How do we make sure those people don't get burnt out as well? And then the Stax guy said, well, we do the same, but it's 53 hours. And then by talking about how you run the business, you discover we have the same culture. I couldn't believe it, because the success and growth of Stax just made me come to the wrong conclusion that they could only function like LEK or other consulting firms where 70-hour weeks are de rigueur, weekend working, and all the rest of it. Yeah. And these guys, that is not the case. And time after time, when we looked at culturally how we approach the business, the same. And in fact, there are certain areas where our culture of collaboration, for example, is even perhaps more ingrained than the way in which they're collaborating across some of their offices. So they're delighted with that. And so I would say cultural due diligence is incredibly important. And I wrote the book, Why Acquisitions Fail, I mentioned earlier. One of the reasons for failure of acquisition is, cultures don't fit, and people would say, yeah, of course. My point is, actually, you can spot that in advance, because the culture is an outcome of the business model. And the classic example I give for that is, if you want to make a good TV show, what you do is you get Ryanair, British Airways, and you do an employee swap. And you swap over 100 employees and you follow them with the film cameras. And of course, they're completely different, because British Airways is all about getting £10,000 for a first class ticket with champagne. And Ryanair is about cheap and charge you whatever. Yeah. Completely different cultures. So if you merge those two companies, it would be a car crash. So you can see it in the business model, because that then reflects in the culture. So I would say that's the number one piece of due diligence to do. And then you can understand what it's going to be like to work with your new colleagues. And I was really fearing having to make compromises on culture, ways of working, and so on. But we were really lucky, and the stars were aligned in that Stax was an incredibly good fit for us.
Brilliant. No, it's nice to hear, because of course you and I will have heard a few disaster stories when it comes to post-sale earnouts and things like that. So it's good to hear a good story. I think I don't want to take too much of your time, and I'm trying to think if there's anything else substantial I should be asking you about the growth of the company. Is there anything you would ask yourself, or I'm missing?
I think
I've done differently, perhaps.
Oh, there are so many things I would have done differently. And I've referred to you about people, positioning, all sorts of things. But it's bumpy, and you have to accept that you take the best decisions you can, and sometimes they're they lead to good results, and sometimes they don't. But we've had more good than bad. I think one thing just to talk to you about is how we found Stax. We did actually appoint a broker to help us, but then the coronavirus came along, and because we'd focused a lot on the events industry, that was then a disaster. And so I had to press the big red button and make sure we got as much cost out as possible, and really shape ourselves to get through that crisis, which worked out. And we know consulting did better than expected in the end. So that was good. But then working with that broker, I mean, we just all agreed it wasn't going to make sense. And then when we came round to where we were, our numbers weren't fantastic because of Corona and so on, but we managed to get ourselves into good shape. And I then simply ran a process internally to say, well, who is it that we should really be connected with? And we got a list of companies, went through them all. And there was one on the list that was really intriguing because they were founded at a similar time to us. They'd grown very well, focused in the United States, and with a very clever structure with a low-cost base in Sri Lanka as well. And I saw that they did international projects. They hired linguists, and they were doing this out of the USA, and they had nothing in London. So I got in touch with them, and I said, look, we should hold hands. And it turned out they were taking private equity investments. And then when that was taken on board and they put in place the right changes they wanted to, they came and said, right, we're ready. And after saying they were ready, they owned us within 3 months.
Wow, that's a very fast turnaround.
And yeah, they were slow to begin with until they were ready. And that is a beauty of a private equity-backed business with a strategy and a purpose. They knew we were the right fit. And so when it happened very quickly. But we'd had a very long and difficult process before that with the coronavirus and the broker and the timing being wrong and so on. But it does show that when things are right, they can really happen quickly.
Just that you used a phrase there, we should hold hands. And so that's a period prior to the deal where presumably there's getting to know each other, perhaps even working together on some projects.
That absolutely can work, but in the world of M&A, you don't just phone someone up and say you should buy us.
Sure,
it's a bit like you might go on a date with someone. You just say, "Well, let's go out and have a drink." You don't talk about other stuff. So it's just the way. It's just the terms that people use. Partnership, joint working, and so on. That can be good. There are firms that have come together because they've collaborated and it's gone well, and then after that they've then one has acquired the other. It's not a guarantee of success. I can think of cases where it hasn't worked, but it's just a term that people use. Sure.
And one final quick question. I know many of my listeners will be interested in the books. Now, most of the listeners to this would be leaders or founders of sort of small boutiques around between 20 to 50 people, maybe a little bit more. For those that are interested in growing towards some form of sale, which of your books should I link to in the show notes?
Yeah, I think the last one was called Acquisition Essentials.
Brilliant.
And I think that even went to a second edition. It's a good book to read, just to teach you, if you don't know much about M&A, just to talk about how it works and the mindset behind it. Yeah.
Brilliant. Denzil, thank you so much for your time. Best of luck for the future, and really appreciate your expertise.
Yeah, great. Lovely speaking to you. Thank you so much. Okay. Right.
Good. Okay. All right. Denzil, thanks so much for that. Fascinating. Really, really interesting. And I hope I haven't taken too much of your time from the huge inbox you must have.
By the way, I don't have an earnout.
Oh, you don't?
No.
No. Interesting.